depending on where you are. I'm in Canada, so it's good morning from here. It's my pleasure to be with you today. We're going to talk today about integrative thinking, particular approach to creative problem solving in organizations. And when we start off, I want to start off with going a little bit back in time to one of the great management thinkers of his age, the great Peter Drucker. And in The Effective Executive, he was writing about the greatest leaders of his generation. And he was writing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s largely, although he wrote to the very end of his life, which was only about 10 years ago now. But when he was writing about The Effective Executive, he wrote about a guy named Alfred Sloan. And if that name is familiar to you, it may be because his name is on a business school, but the reason his name is on a business school is that he was one of the most effective CEOs of his generation. He was the CEO of General Motors from the middle of the 1920s to the middle of the 1950s. And what that means is that he took a small startup, essentially, one of hundreds of little companies trying to figure out how to make money from this new invention, the automobile, and turned it into what was at the time the largest and most important company in the world in many ways. And Drucker is writing about Sloan as a leader, and he tells a particular story about Sloan sitting at his senior leadership table, and they're attempting to make a decision, and he says, "Gentlemen," because it was the 40s, so it was all guys. "Gentlemen, I take it we're in complete agreement here on the decision." Everyone around the table nodded assent. "Then," continued Mr. Sloan, "I propose we postpone further discussion of this matter until our next meeting to give ourselves time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding of what the decision is all about." Now, this is a pretty striking model of leadership, particularly in our modern conception of leadership, which is about building consensus and generating agreement. Sloan here is actively seeking disagreement. I love this. Let's give ourselves time to come to disagreement. This idea of leveraging opposition, leveraging opposing ideas, is what we're going to talk about this morning. The idea of using opposing ideas to come to a better answer. Now, Sloan was not alone in this approach. You may have heard this quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald. He also, in the 1940s, wrote that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Now, that line is quite famous. The next line isn't as famous, but I actually think that it should be. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless, yet be determined to make them otherwise. I love that. I think it's sort of a mission statement for life, particularly these days. So this idea of taking opposing ideas and doing something productive rather than being paralyzed by them, rather than being totally stuck or moving very, very quickly to react, but actually holding them in mind together, is pretty old. This is the 1940s, and if any of you have studied philosophy, you might be saying to yourself, the idea is in fact much older than that philosophers like Hegel and Kant were writing about the value of opposing ideas hundreds of years ago, and as with many things, the West didn't come up with the idea either. If you go back to Eastern thinkers from Buddha to Confucius, this idea continues to come up again and again. So if it is a valuable thing to do, the idea of holding opposing ideas in mind and dwelling on them, what stops us from doing it? Well, Fitzgerald has a theory. He says most of us aren't smart enough. He says it takes a first-rate intelligence. I don't know about that. I think he may have been a product of his time in that regard. But I do think it's incredibly challenging to do, and that is because of the way that our minds work. It turns out that the world is more complex than we can actually make sense of in real time. So any square inch of the world has more complexity in it than we can take in, process, and make sense of in the moment. And so our minds do us a favor that we are blissfully unaware of. Every time we interact with a person, a place, a thing, an idea, our mind builds a model of that thing, a simplified understanding, a lens through which we see and experience the world. And these mental models become our reality. They are what we see and experience. We're not aware of it. We're not aware that we are leaving things out. We're not aware that we're not paying attention to some things and others. But we experience the effect of this, if you've ever been to a meeting where you are sitting and listening intently and paying attention, except for those few moments where you're thinking about what's for lunch or where you need to go after work. But you're focused, you're paying attention, and you leave the meeting absolutely clear on the course of action. You are absolutely certain about the key takeaways and pieces of action that need to follow. And you sit next to your colleague who is also in the meeting, and she says to you, well, it's pretty obvious what we're supposed to do on the basis of this, and then proceeds to explain something that is totally different from what you took away from the meeting. And you think to yourself, what meeting was she in? Well, she has a very different model, a different experience of that meeting than you do. And this is just a function of how our minds work. Now, mental models aren't unhelpful. They're actually incredibly valuable. They exist because they help us make sense of a complex world. They help us focus on the things that matter. If you had to pay attention to absolutely everything, you simply couldn't pay attention to the things that matter and get things done. So they're shortcuts that let us take action. If you think about this distant relative here, thinking about if he had to start from first principles when he saw the saber-toothed cat and think to himself, well, that's a mammal and it has big teeth and some mammals are friendly and some of them aren't. At this point, he would have been eaten. And so evolution has pushed us towards mental models that move us to thinking very, very quickly. And if you've read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he writes about this phenomenon, the fact that we rely on these surface mental models to move to action very, very quickly. So they're not bad. They allow us to function in the world. But they can be dangerous. They can be dangerous in that we're not aware that we hold them. We think we see everything. We think we have access to the full reality of the situation. So these models influence our behavior and the choices that we make, and they're almost impossible to escape when we're unaware of them, when it just feels like the right answer, when we adopt them unconsciously. And so this keeps us from being open to learning. But the biggest challenge tends to be when other people are involved. So just as you are engaging in a complex world, making sense of it by simplifying, leaving things out, so are they. But they are doing it in a different way than you are. They are actually building very different models, and that model isn't better or worse than yours, but it is different. They are leaving out different things. They are focusing on different things, and so they come to very different models of the same thing. And the challenge that we face is that we believe we're extremely productive in the face of opposing models. This is the work of Chris Argyris, the management thinker at Harvard, and he says that we have our espoused theory of action, how we think we are in the world. We believe we're very open-minded and that we're authentically ourselves, and we take the time to reflect, and we're gracious under pressure or in the face of conflict. But we actually have these theories that we default to. We call them governing values. And the governing values aren't very pretty, but they exist, again, for a reason, for survival. Our theories in use are that we should win instead of lose, avoid embarrassment, stay rational, and maintain control. And in the face of an opposing model, someone who sees the world very differently than you do, we very often default to these sorts of behaviors. We seek to convince the other person that they're wrong so that we can win and avoid being embarrassed. It is embarrassing if we're wrong. And we try to maintain control of the situation by enforcing the model that we hold, by saying that it is the single right answer. In other words, we tend to default to one of two particular approaches in the face of opposing models because we forget that they're simply models of the world. One is the flee response, to avoid the idea that there is another model worth engaging in, to say there is a single right answer and I found that single right answer. And so I must either crush that opposing model or be crushed by it, cave into it. We have to just embrace one of the two answers and move on. That is one possible approach to opposing models. The other is a little friendlier, but it's not necessarily all that much more productive. This is to say, all right, there may well be opposing views of the world that we should engage in, and we're going to call them options. And we're going to lay out all of the options on the table, and we're going to evaluate those options equally. And through the process of analysis, we will get less excited about every single possibility. But in the end, we will choose the one option that is least destroyed by the process of analysis. Or maybe we'll realize that we can't simply move forward with any of them because we'll never reach consensus. We have to compromise and take some of the good and some of the bad of the existing models and push forward with a consensus option. In both of these two approaches, the existence of opposing models has slowed us down. It has created hard feelings, particularly in the first model, where if we're attempting to argue about our point of view, we tend to explain our view, then we explain it again, slower and louder, as if the other person simply didn't understand. And again, this can produce real interpersonal conflict in organizations. What we've found is that these are not the only approaches to opposing models. If what we want to do is follow Fitzgerald and Sloan and attempt to actually leverage opposing models, we need to take another approach, and that is an approach we call integrative thinking. There are leaders up there who've embraced this approach, and when they do, they actually go seek out the tension of opposing models. Think about Sloan saying we need to give ourselves time to come to disagreement. They actually enjoy experiencing the tension, or at least willing to engage in experiencing the tension of the opposing ideas, and want to drive for a new insight before they proceed to a decision. They believe that if the options on the table are not good enough, that it is their job to use the existing models to create something better, to seek a better answer, to be creators rather than choosers. So what does this look like in organizations? What does this look like in the real world? So I'll give you an example. So this is a real example from a company called Procter & Gamble, and you may be familiar with them. They make Crest and Pampers and Tide. They're a large global consumer packaged goods company, the largest consumer packaged goods company in the world. And this is a story from the year 2000 when their current CEO, A.G. Lafley, was promoted to the role of CEO. And it was a really challenging time for the company. They had really been struggling throughout most of the 1990s. They were struggling in part because of the narrative of the times. They were being told that they were a boring, stodgy, old economy company, that their time had passed, that all of the real creation of value was happening in small startups around the world, that tech was the future, and that manufacturing, like Procter & Gamble, was being consigned to the dustbin of history. And that narrative was a problem only insofar as it had a grain of truth in it. They really were struggling on the innovation front. And in fact, A.G.'s predecessor had recognized this fundamental challenge. He recognized that in an organization like Procter & Gamble, there are really two kinds of innovation that happen. The first is incremental innovation, and that is the kind of innovation where you take what you're already doing and you make it just a little bit better. And it turns out large companies are quite good at that. They can invent a new flavor of Crest, and they can get it on the supermarket shelves, and they can steal a little bit of share from Colgate, and a few people who were using the other flavors of Crest switch over, and they grow just a little bit. So they were not really struggling on that front. They had managed to do that quite productively for years. But there's another kind of innovation where they were struggling quite mightily, and that kind of innovation is breakthrough innovation. New products and categories that have never been considered before. Real invention of new ideas. And P&G had been created on that kind of innovation, and they'd made billions of dollars. For instance, in the 1960s, they had invented the modern disposable diaper, called it Pampers, and changed the industry on the basis of that invention. But it had been a really long time since they had had that kind of meaningful change, that kind of meaningful innovation. And so A.G.'s predecessor realized that he needed to fix the innovation problem, and he knew what he needed to do. He knew that if something really matters, you have to be prepared to invest in it. And so he dramatically ramped up the amount of money the company was spending on innovation. By some accounts, he tripled the amount of money that was going into R&D in the company. And the problem with that is that innovation takes some time to take hold, And after about 18 months on the job, it really hadn't started to pay off, but the short-term financials were looking absolutely disastrous because that massive investment had wiped out the profit of the company. So their stock price dropped in half, 7 of their top 10 brands were losing market share, and so AG's predecessor was fired. AG gets the top job and still has the problem. The problem hasn't been solved. And he's got 2 groups of people in the company speaking to him. One says, you know what? It's the right answer. Exactly what your predecessor suggested is what you should do. You should continue to invest in innovation. It's the lifeblood of the company. It is how we will succeed. It is how we will move forward. And so just keep on the same path. Keep investing in innovation. Give it time. Now, there were things he liked about that model. He certainly liked the idea of fixing the innovation problem. He liked the idea of actually being an innovative company over the long term. But again, this was the approach that had gotten the last guy fired. He wasn't quite ready to dive in wholeheartedly to that answer. And on the other hand, there was a whole other group that said, we simply won't survive if we continue to invest at this level. We absolutely need to get our innovation spending in line with the industry. We've got to improve our short-term financials. We've got to accept that we're a marketing company and not an innovation company. We're never really going to be an innovator. The times we've succeeded in innovation were lucky. They were flukes. And so it is our job to get the short-term financials in line. Maybe if we do that, we'll actually make a bonus this year. And that was really what the argument was on the other side. And as AG looked at these 2 approaches, he recognized that neither of the options gave him what he needed. He liked the idea of improving the short-term financials, but if he cut innovation spending and accepted that they just weren't an innovative company, then he believed that was the recipe for the slow decline of the company. So he knew that he actually needed a better answer. He, in fact, needed way more innovation than the company had ever had, and he needed it for way less money than they had traditionally spent. And that is an extraordinarily high bar, right? It is not about picking the point between what we spend today and what we used to spend and figuring out through analysis what's the Pareto optimal spend. It was a different way of thinking about the problem. He needed a fundamentally different approach. Way more innovation for way less money. And if any of you in your organizations have ever been told to do more with less, you know that simply being told that isn't enough. You need a way. You need the how. And so AG recognized that he needed to take a step back and really think about the fundamentals of this problem and think about it differently. If we go back to Einstein's famous definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, he believed if he thought about the problem the same way he had always thought about it, that he would come to the same answer. And so he took a step back and he asked himself about the fundamentals of innovation. How does innovation really work? And in fact, how does innovation respond to money? Because that's the key variable here, right? How much do I need to spend to get the kind of innovation that I really need? And as he thought about it, he recognized the models that the company had been operating from were actually pretty simplistic. It was almost as if innovation was a magical black box, right? You put some money in, something magical happens inside, and you get innovation and great results out of the other end. And so if you invest more money, you will get more magic, more innovation, better results. And he wondered to what extent that actually held in practice. And the more he thought about it, the more he recognized that when it comes to money, there's not one innovation process. There are at least 2. And the hint is right there in the name. If we think about research and development, right, those are 2 distinct and discrete activities, or we call them the same thing. And research is invention, right? Research is coming up with new-to-the-world ideas, early stage experimentation, where lots of ideas occur to us and most of them fail. That's research. Then we have development, which is the commercialization of the ideas that come out of the research engine. And commercialization involves, taking the idea, getting it to real working prototypes, getting it out in the world, manufacturing, selling, getting it on supermarket shelves around the world. And he asked himself, to what extent do those two activities respond similarly or differently to money? Well, when you look at commercialization, the development part of R&D, it turns out that investing more money than your competition is a really sound idea. There are real meaningful economies of scale that come in the development of great ideas. You can buy your materials at a lower price. You can have a better relationship with Walmart or Carrefour and get it on supermarket shelves, and you can advertise at a lower price. And so the development of ideas has real scale economies. The problem was that wasn't where most of the money in R&D was going. Most of the money was going to research, and that is because research is, in all organizations around the world, a pretty cash-intensive proposition. And that goes back to this fundamental challenge of research, which is that many of the ideas we start to develop earn absolutely no return of any kind. It's the big pharmaceutical company problem. The reason our on-patent pharmaceuticals cost so much money is that for every drug that succeeds and makes it through human trials and actually treats the disease it's set out to treat, many, many more have failed along the way. So every successful product has to pay for all the ones that failed. The same held true in consumer goods. As it turned out, as AG looked at the money, about 15% of the new product innovation projects earned any kind of a return at all, which means for every additional dollar he spent on research, on invention, he was throwing away 85 cents. And if he could figure out which were the 15% and which were the 85, that would be one thing. But it seemed like no matter what they did, that was about as good as they could get to. So he wasn't willing to invest a lot more in research and invention inside the company. It was just throwing good money after bad. And so he wondered whether there was a different way of thinking about research that might shift the balance in his favor and actually enable him to have more money to spend, or more innovation for less money. And it happened to be the case that around that same time he attended a class where he was learning about open source software, the kind of free software where people will go in and co-develop the source code of the software. And he was so intrigued by this idea, he wondered to what extent it could actually work in consumer goods. You see, he started to wonder whether or not a large, multinational, global, and frankly bureaucratic company like Procter & Gamble was really the kind of place where the invention of new ideas was likely to happen at a powerful and impressive pace. And in fact, there was lots of evidence that it wasn't, that where new ideas were really coming fast and furious and really changing the world, they were coming out of university laboratories and garages. You know, two people working in a garage in Palo Alto, California, have the potential to change the world. And P&G had always been a company that said that all that mattered was their own proprietary position on an idea, that they needed to have a patent for anything that they went out into the world with. And again, he started to question that conventional wisdom. He said, to what extent do my customers care who invented the technology behind the innovation? And he recognized that, frankly, they don't care at all. Many of them aren't even aware that Crest is made by a company called Procter & Gamble. They're just buying Crest, or they're buying the great product that they want and love. So he said, what if instead of throwing money at invention inside the company, we accept that the best we'll ever do is 15% return, and we instead dramatically reduce the amount of money we're spending internally on invention, and we actually go out into the world and we seek to connect with inventors out there in the world. And we look at their ideas, we vet their ideas, and probably, quite frankly, about 15% of those ideas will be worth anything at all. And for that 15%, we'll probably have to spend a little bit more money than we would have if we'd invented it ourselves. But if we cast the net widely enough, there will be more ideas than if we were simply doing it ourselves. But the really powerful part of this idea is, what do we need to spend for the 85% of ideas that look unlikely to earn any kind of a return at all? Nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. We thank the inventor for their time and we move on to the next. He called it Connect and Develop, and he asked that for the future of the company, moving forward, 50% of new product innovations would come from outside the company within 5 years. They would go out, find innovations and inventions, purchase them from the inventor or license them from the inventor, and develop them internally, dramatically increasing the number of innovations running through their development engine, but doing so at far less cost overall. And it has been one of the most successful initiatives in the history of the company. I was speaking with the person who's in charge of this particular part of the business a few weeks ago, and she said that, in fact, she believes there's not a single new product innovation that leaves the company today that doesn't have some outside technology, some element of connect and develop inside of it. And it can happen from almost any technology in almost any way. So my favorite example of this is that P&G actually licensed the technology from a company that made spinning lollipops. So this is a candy that sits on the stem of a little stick, and it had a button on the stem, and if you pressed the button, the top of the lollipop would spin around really slowly. So it was like candy for very lazy children, essentially. And P&G licensed that technology. They purchased the technology from the company that was making the lollipops, and they didn't do it because they were interested in food. They had no interest in the candy itself, but it was this very tiny, very inexpensive motor. And if it could make the lollipop spin around, then perhaps it could do the same for a toothbrush. At the time, there were two kinds of toothbrushes, the $2 low technology manual toothbrush we all grew up with, and the $200 water pick. And they re-engineered the technology of the spinning lollipop to create the Crest Spin Brush, a $10 disposable electric toothbrush that bridged the gap between those two extremes. And it was one of the most successful new product launches in the history of the company. Now, when AG was asked, how do you do this? How do you fundamentally believe that a better answer is possible? Most people would say, you either cut the innovation spend and get the short-term financials in line, or you invest in R&D and get long-term growth. You somehow believed that you could come to an answer where you got the best of both, not a mere compromise, but a better answer. And what led you to believe that was possible? And when we asked him that, he said that fundamentally he knew that was his job, that anybody could find the or answer, this or this, just choose. But that the company wouldn't win, that he wasn't truly creating new value and changing the organization if he accepted the trade-off that he found unacceptable. It was his job to overcome that trade-off and seek a better answer. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about integrative thinking. It is the ability to face constructively the tension of opposing models, and instead of just choosing one very quickly at the expense of the other or dwelling in the conflict forever, seeking a creative resolution of the tension, a better answer, a new model that contains elements of those original models but is superior to each. That's what we're talking about when it comes to integrative thinking. And my boss, Roger Martin, wrote a book called The Opposable Mind in 2007 that really laid out this theory. And over the last decade, we've really been focused on thinking about how this applies across industries, across organizations. As we said, we're now teaching children about this particular way of thinking because we believe that these kinds of tensions, these trade-offs, are universal, and they can really prevent us from being productive as leaders. If you think about your own role as a leader, very often we have these tensions within us that we never quite resolve, that we never quite manage to overcome. So here's one I struggle with as a leader. I know if I simply take the task that needs to be done and do it myself, it will be done right and it will be done quickly. But I have a team that I need to develop, and so I also feel the imperative to delegate even some of the most important things that we do in order to develop them. And it feels often like we're making a trade-off between these two things. And wouldn't it be nice to have a better answer or a theory of how to approach the world that balances that comes from doing it ourselves, the efficiency that comes from doing it ourselves, with the development that comes from delegation? Also, as a leader, am I spending my time developing and enhancing the work of the high performers, or am I focused on remediating and improving the lower performers? There are only so many hours in the day. How do we think about a better answer? And the last one is an organizational structure one that I think every organization struggles with. We inherited from the military a conception of the world that says we can lead through command and control. The person at the head of the organization gives an order, and we all salute and do what we're told. And over the last few decades, we've seen real diminishing returns to that kind of an approach. People want to have autonomy. They want to be able to make choices. And so while command and control is incredibly efficient and simple to organize, we've seen a shift to the notion of distributed leadership, where people are owning their own responsibility. They have autonomy. They have leadership accountability across the organization. And in order to move to that, we give up a lot of the aligning mechanisms that come from command and control. It's certainly more agile, but is it as focused? And again, many organizations simply choose, or they find themselves swinging from one extreme to the other. We try command and control and it doesn't work for us, and so we shift all the way to the extreme of a really distributed model. And then we see the diminishing returns and the challenge of that, and so we switch all the way back. Some of you may have experienced this in your own organizations when it comes to things like centralization and decentralization, right? It's hard to be centralized and decentralized at the same time, and so we tend to swing back and forth. We try one and then we try the other. And integrative thinking is about saying, well, before we settle, could we actually seek to create a better answer? And so one of the things I'd ask you to think about as you come out of today is, what are some of the competing models and opposing tensions that you face as a leader? How do you think about overcoming those? And there are really three questions that I would encourage you to think about if you want to apply integrative thinking to yourself, if you actually want to go and do this in your own organization. The first is an openness to other people. Recall that you have a model of the world, and so do other people. They see it differently than you do. And what that means is that they see things you don't see. They have the ability to help you make your model better. So your model is wrong, so is theirs, but they're wrong in different ways. And so if you put them together, you may be able to create a better answer. So asking yourself, what do others see that I don't see? Rather than seeing that person with a different model as annoying or an impediment or frustrating, asking yourself, what is it that they see that I don't see? What could I learn from their model of the world? And if all that it does is help you understand their perspective a little bit better, you're still further along than if you've argued or dismissed their point of view. It's also about openness to ideas. It's about taking those two models of the world and putting them in front of you and asking yourself what you can learn from each of them. When we teach this in a longer form, we talk about the process of falling in love with the opposing models, and this can be incredibly challenging. It's one thing when the two models are both in your own head. It's another when one is something you hold very close and very dear, and the other is one that you struggle with. I often talk about, I taught a group of physicians once about integrative thinking, and wanted to choose a topic that would be of interest to them to dive into and play with, and so decided we would talk about vaccines, which, as you may know, in the medical field is a very hot topic these days. We know medically that vaccines are incredibly important to herd immunity, that they make us all safer, but there is a growing group of people who are choosing not to vaccinate their children for various reasons. And what the medical institutions have typically done is say to those people who are not vaccinating their children that they are just wrong, scientifically wrong, morally wrong, stupid, or evil for not vaccinating their children. And the conversation that we had with these physicians was to say, well, the other model and the people who hold it has actually led to those people increasing in number. It's produced the opposite of the effect that we want. And if you've been in an organization where you've seen that, where you've tried to stamp out something and actually produced more of it, this is about saying, how do I take a step back and instead of dismissing the opposing model, seek to learn from it? And in this particular, it was a case of saying, what could I learn from a model where parents want to take responsibility have accountability for their child's health. So what can I learn from each opposing model? And then openness to possibility. How might I create a better answer? No guarantee that you will succeed, but it is the point of believing that it just could be possible. Not a perfect answer. There are no perfect answers, but a better answer than we have today. And is that worth striving for? Is that worth seeking to achieve? Ultimately, what this is about is the stance that we have in the world. And stance, as Roger Martin wrote in The Opposable Mind, is like mindset. It's how you see the world around you, but it's also how you see yourself in that world. It's your view of the world. And our colleague Hillary Austin, who also writes about stance and about integrative thinking, said this. She said, your stance is the thing that orients you to practice. It guides your action. It's a bunch of overarching knowledge, and it's your culture and your discipline and your social identity, your values, your roles, and your motivations. And here's the important part of what Hillary has to say. Our stance is largely tacit. It's deeply embedded. We're not conscious of it. If I say to you, what is your stance about what it means to be a professional, it would be very hard for you to quickly articulate that for me, unless I accused you of being unprofessional, in which case you could probably articulate it pretty quickly. It rarely bears scrutiny except in times of transformational change. It is quietly developed and is often taken for granted. But here's why our stance matters so much. Our stance is a powerful motivator to action. It leads us to behave in very different ways. And I'll give you a simple metaphor, a simple example of what this means. I want you to imagine there are two chefs. And these chefs have exactly the same tools, generally the same experiences. They both formally trained as chefs. They have the same ingredients sitting in front of them, the same equipment, and the same general intention. They want to make a dish of braised veal. That is what they want to do. The difference between these two chefs is the stance they hold about what it means to be a chef, their conception of what it means to be a chef. One of these two chefs believes that food is love, that food is the best ingredients that you can find, prepared as simply as you possibly can, and presented without fuss, without flourish, but with genuine affection. And if you hold that stance, you might produce the farmhouse version of the dish that you see on your screen in the yellow bowl. But it's not the only possible stance about what it means to be a chef. You can also have a stance that says food is art, that food is, again, great ingredients, but that you feast not just with your taste buds, but with your eyes. And so food needs to be beautiful and, in fact, architectural. And if you had that stance about what it means to be a chef, you might produce a version of braised veal that looks a little more like Thomas Keller's from the French Laundry. The same ingredients, the same intention, the difference is the stance that these two chefs hold about what it means to be a chef. So how does stance apply to integrative thinking? I don't want to suggest that there's a right or wrong stance in the world. Your mindset is your own personally developed and cultivated stance over a long period of time. But I want to present to you a stance that you could try on for size. It's a thought experiment where you can play with this stance and see to what extent it helps you strive for and achieve integrative answers rather than settling for a compromise. So here's the 6 elements of this stance. 1, about the world. A recognition that the existing models of the world, the choices that are on the table in front of me, aren't all there is. They're not the full reality. They're constructions, and they might be good, they might be bad, but they are flawed. And so if that's true, that opposing models aren't quite so scary then, right? I can have an answer that I like very much and still not be frustrated by the emergence of opposing model. That opposing model can be leveraged to make the answer I have even better. Because there's a fundamental belief that better models exist, even if they're not yet seen. And as I say, I've been teaching this now for about a decade, and very often at this point there is someone who's struggling a little bit with this particular third piece, often an engineer or a scientist, who will say, sometimes there are right answers about the world. And I always smile to myself at this point, because what is the history of science? The history of science is the history history of better models constantly appearing that challenge the models that existed before. And this is true even in the case of models presented by legitimate scientific geniuses. So if we think about Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest thinkers of all time, he articulated a way of thinking about the physical world that was so smart and so thoughtful that we called them the fundamental laws of physics. And we taught them that way as the single right answer, the answer for understanding the physical world for hundreds of years, until someone outside the scientific community who was working as a patent clerk came in and said, well, that is a really good model of the world, but it leaves things out. It misses things. And I think if we include things like relativity and other dimensions, we can improve our understanding of the physical world. And so Einstein was able to create for us a better model, a fuller model that took Newton's work and pushed it further. So better models exist even if they're not yet seen. Now, I cannot promise you that every time you go looking for a better model, you will find it. But I can promise you that if you don't, it's very unlikely. So there is a fundamental conception about our role that we are capable of finding better models, that it is within our skill set. And my sense from having taught children of all ages, and all the way up to senior executives, I've yet to find a person who couldn't, with effort and enthusiasm, find something of a better model. Again, not perfect, but an improvement on what we have today. But it does take getting into complexity. Simplicity is incredibly attractive. It is this siren call. It's incredibly alluring for us. But in order to come to better answers, we have to wade into and get through some of the complexity to come out the other side. And it does take some time. It takes giving yourself a bit of time to think, which is a bit of a luxury in a world where we are really pushing for answers, for action, to move very quickly. And this is saying, for those problems that matter, I need to give myself some time to create and develop a new insight before proceeding. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys about integrative thinking. And I wanted to give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have. So I think that I hand the microphone back over and see what you guys might have to say, or comments or questions about any of this.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Riel, for a very interesting presentation. Folks, we are open for question and answers, so if you have any questions, you could put it in the question box, or you could raise your hand. There is a hand icon available on the console, so if you click on it, it will give you a chance to talk directly to Ms. Riel. So let me go straight to the caller raised hand, one of our regular callers, Dr. Muhammad Faridi. Doctor, could you please introduce once again yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, hi Jennifer. Thank you for such a great presentation. I'm a professor here in Kingdom Saudi Arabia. I had one thing about sharing something about the experience I faced, and also then I have a small question for you. The first is that in the integrative thinking, there's possibilities of conflicts always will be there. So I just want to cite an example of a grocery store where we have the supply chain department, and the second is a category management. For example, the supply chain will be more focusing on the service level improvements, and not to compromise on the service level, even though they have to do some market buys, short-term market buys. Whereas the category management will be more focused on the dollar value and the trade-offs, as well as they will minimize buying for the short-term from the market buy, as well as they will more focus on buying from the official vendors or the vendors they have already had a contract with. So the conflicts, when we have the conflicts there, and when you're depicted on that the integrative thinking stance about the world. So I like to sum up, like, is it about the world will be more organic done, like the organic way of doing things, which will be giving more kind of a genuinity and authenticity of actually taking, instead of doing a cut and paste. And the second was about the role in it, where I feel is it's more. I appreciate that the way you have depicted that. Well, I've taken a stance that it should be more value driver or facilitators there where there'll be more collaboration taking place. So that's my thing.
Great. I think those are great questions. On the first one, I think you've highlighted something that is really, really common, which is that very often the conflicts that require integrative thinking aren't within an individual, but between individuals and organizations, right? You've got the category folks thinking one way, you've got the folks in other parts of the organization thinking differently. Often it's engineering and marketing, right? Different parts of the organization who see the world very differently. And the way we think about this is that the challenge is to recognize that your particular approach, your particular orthodoxy is still a model, and that your job as leaders is to find ways to bridge across those two different models, to understand the thinking and the perspective of the people who are going into the category side, that you need to have a set of tools, processes, ways of communicating that help you understand those two opposing models and recognize that they are models. And I think that on your second point, it's very, very true that this is about collaboration. This is about saying, how do we together create better answers? I often say that integrative thinking is an individual skill, yes, but it's a team sport. We do a better job at integrative thinking when we have a diverse team sitting around the table and we can actually leverage the perspectives of those different people.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree to that. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer, for such a wonderful presentation. I really loved this kind of presentation. And thanks, Ali Rafi, for giving us this opportunity to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad. And let me move to the question box. There's a question. How is this similar or different to design thinking, system thinking, or other thought of disciplines?
So design thinking, for those of you who have familiarity with it, design thinking is about saying, how do we leverage the tools of the designer, so deep user understanding, prototyping, and testing, to create new answers, to generate new possibilities. And then, of course, systems thinking is about thinking across the entire system. So it comes out of the world of engineering. How do we think about the cause and effect of the system as it exists and think about change more holistically rather than a small part? And the way that I think about the intersection is that integrative thinking can actually leverage the tools from both, right? So I think a great integrative thinker is going to be considering the system's dynamics, as AG did, right? AG thought about what were the effects of money on the different parts of the organization, the different parts of innovation. So it leverages the tools of systems dynamics, and it certainly can leverage iterative prototyping and testing from the world of design thinking. These are new ideas, and it's not necessarily the case that you want to just invent a new idea and go dive in head first and try it and say to the organization, trust me, it'll be awesome. It's not so much that. It's about saying, we have this new answer. What might we do to generate some evidence, some thought about what it could look like in the marketplace? How do we test and play? And so there are tools you can borrow from both of those two disciplines to make integrative thinking even better.
Thank you very much. There's another one. Is this for all kinds of choices? What kinds of decisions should use integrated thinking?
So this is one I'm asked a lot because sometimes people will look at this and say, well, that seems like an awful lot of work. And what if there's a great answer in front of me? In those cases, then you should take it. If there's a great answer, a great choice in front of you, then I think in the interest of time and efficiency that you should embrace that answer that you have and that you are comfortable with. Integrative thinking, as we describe it, really fits best when the problem really matters and where the answers in front of you aren't good enough, where you feel yourself really torn, either because the two options as you look at them don't really solve the problem, they don't get you where you need to go, or they're both great possibilities and you can't figure out how to do them both, and choosing one forces you to give up a great deal of the other. And so integrative thinking is for those times where you simply simply wish you didn't have to choose, where the answers don't get you where you need to go. And that's the point where we say, take a step back, seek to understand and fall in love with the existing models, and use that understanding, use that experience to create a better answer.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
What are some of the key steps that you would recommend to our organization which would like to introduce integrative culture thinking?
So the way that I tend to think about it, integrative thinking has a couple of key steps. The first is to think about when we're framing the problem. You might just have a problem. You might not immediately be clear about what the opposing models are, and that's fine. What you would do is take the problem and say, what are two really different, really opposing ways of solving this problem? You can seek to create the tension of opposing models and actually make them quite extreme. So there will be lots and lots and lots of versions, compromises in between the two extremes. And what we found is actually really thinking about the extremes and holding them in tension is where most of the value comes from. So instead of saying, you know, what would it look like if we were a little centralized and a little decentralized? It's saying, no, what would this organization be if it were totally decentralized? What would that look like, and what would it get us? And then you look at the other side and say, you know, if we were totally centralized, what would it look like? What would it get us? So you create real tension between the opposing models, and then you dig into them. You say, for the people who matter most, for our customers and our employees and our shareholders, what do these models give us? What do we actually get from embracing these models, and what are the benefits that come from them? And as you really sketch that out and understand what works about these models, you can then say, all right, how might I bring these models together? How might I take the things, the pieces, the elements I most care about and create something new? And that is just a process of playing and prototyping and exploring and experimenting. And then you can prototype some of those ideas and take them out to the people who matter and say, how about this, or what about that, and how might we test and experiment and play? So that tends to be a general process that we take people through. So identify two extreme opposing models, seek to really understand how they work and what's great about them, and then use the things you most value to seek to create the better answer.
As an example, could you name some of the leaders who you think could be considered better integrative thinkers in corporate or public sectors?
Sure, and I think there are folks across different organizations, different kinds of roles. So A.G. Lafley is certainly one from Procter & Gamble. Isidore Sharp, the founder of the Four Seasons, we saw him really create a powerful answer that was better than the existing models of small motels and large convention hotels in the world. Jack Welch, at certain points of his career, was able to find integrative answers that helped him turn General Electric into the most valuable company in the world at the time that he left. And then we also see people working in different fields. So one of my favorite examples is a woman who founded a not-for-profit pharmaceutical company, which sounds like an oxymoron, but really exists. Dr. Victoria Hale, who founded the Institute for One World Health, and she wanted to bridge the worlds of traditional big pharmaceutical companies where you're able to get really great development and innovation of drugs with the world of public health where you're addressing the most vexing problems in the world. And she wanted to create a model that actually gave you the best of both, where you had great drugs that were being developed for diseases of poverty. So all sorts of different folks across different industries. Not all great leaders are integrative thinkers. I would say there's no evidence that Steve Jobs, for instance, took this particular approach. I think he was a phenomenal leader, but I haven't seen much evidence that he was an integrative thinker. I think he was much more about choosing the great answers that were in front of him.
One short last question. What about time? Does this take longer to take decisions?
So again, this is one people often worry a little bit about. If I'm going to take the time to understand the models in front of me, is it going to take a really long time? And I think it takes the time that you have. I mean, if you think about it, very often, however much time we have to come to an answer, very often what we end up doing is coming quickly to the answer and then spending the rest of the time bulletproofing the argument, like building the perfect PowerPoint deck to justify the choice that we made. And this is about saying, how do you use that time a little differently? If what we care about is the time from the presentation of the problem to really effective action at the other end, we actually believe integrative thinking takes less time because you're engaging people in the answer so that there's a lot less selling and a lot less resistance and a lot less challenge actually getting the problem implemented. So we actually believe that it can take less time. It's just how you're spending your time. You're doing more thinking up front and hopefully moving to action more effectively and more quickly at the back end of the process.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Riel. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
I would just like to thank you all for your time. It's been my pleasure to speak with all of you. And if you have any questions or anything that you would like to ask me about, I'm on Twitter and I have my email in the presentation as well. I'd be delighted to hear from any of you as you go out and experiment with this and you try it. And if it works, please let me know. I'd love to hear your stories.
Well, thank you very much. It's been really great to have you on our platform all the way from Rockman. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank you on the behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for the time that you've taken to deliver this live webinar. We really appreciate it and quite grateful to you. So thank you very much, Ms. Riel. And thank you all of those who
You're
participated.
very welcome.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording this webinar, which will be uploaded on the Mile community, so please stay tuned to community.mile.org. Also visit webinar.mile.org to learn about our upcoming webinars and register for free. So thank you very much. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.